Hello, and welcome to YAGR's first impressions on Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice by Ninja Theory. As the warning on the screen suggests, some of the images you're about to see may be considered disturbing as they depict feelings of psychosis, so please be aware of that going into this video. First off, I'd like to thank everyone for their patience. Hellblade did not come out till very late on Monday night, and as such, we were unable to make a first impressions on our scheduled Monday that would have been accurate and properly representative of Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, so we had to delay till Tuesday. Expect that to happen a few times. Normally we'll put out an update video, but there was a few struggles in that process. You'll be informed, and if you follow our Twitter, then you will also be aware of these delays. So, into the review of Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. The first thing I have to say about this game is it is not necessarily game so much as an interactive cinematic experience. As you can see and will see through the clips of playthrough we have for you, there is nothing even remotely resembling a HUD. In fact, the only thing that is non-game content that shows up is the subtitles that you can turn off in the options, of course. This is an interesting choice, and we'll get into why in a little bit. But essentially, to sum up Senua's Sacrifice, as far as quality goes, it does a few things extremely well, and it does some things not so well. And that's why I say it's an interactive cinematic experience. Because it doesn't feel like a game, and frankly, I don't think a video game is the right term for it. So we're going to get into why that is. Again, this is our first impressions. We have approximately 2 to 3 hours of playtime on it, on the playthrough team right now. And this is for first impressions formations. Deep dive, we will have much more time on it, of course. But the first thing I'm going to go over in our first impressions very briefly is the graphics and sound design and world and level and enemy design. Senua herself is very beautifully crafted. In fact, particularly her eyes, and this goes from the actual art as well as the animations in her. Her eyes are constantly shifting, and they look and feel realistic in the way that they move when you look at her face. The way she moves is pretty good. There are a couple juddery points, and particularly after the first cutscene, her clothes were doing some weird stuff. There was kind of a stuttering animation, but I haven't ever seen that since the beginning of the game, so pretty minor complaint there. Overall, Senua herself looks and feels fairly real outside of combat, and that's solid. And I believe that she was a Celtic, I believe she's supposed to be a Pictish warrior. There's some historical accuracies and representations within this. The world itself looks beautifully crafted. I think they've done a good job meshing Celtic and Norse Viking mythology together to form this world, and you can see kind of its influences in other places and things like that. So that's truly interesting the way it came out, and I think it's thematically appropriate, and they crafted it very well. The enemies are, I suppose, without spoiling anything, supposed to be hell-like Norsemen, and they certainly feel that way. They tower over Senua as the player character and use these vast, sweeping strikes that are very much designed around heavy strength, which, from what I understand and from watching their dev diaries, is roughly what the Vikings were about, and the Pictish were a little bit more agile and more martially trained fighters, so I think they did a good representation of that. The hellish enemies you fight also look and feel appropriate as you fight them. So that goes over looks of the game pretty much. The animations and motions of everything feel good outside of combat, things like that. The next thing I want to talk about is sound, and it is so important in this game. They recommend that you play it with headphones so that you can get the actual feel of what's going on in Senua's head. And frankly, it was some of the most disturbing experience I've ever felt, because it sounds like the voices in her head are in your head. They speak in your left ear, they speak in your right ear, they speak in both ears but one louder than the other. Some of them are nagging, some of them are friendly and helpful. It's crazy, and it makes it harder for you as the player to think. And it really immerses you in that feeling of the psychosis that this woman must be feeling, and the conflict and internal strife within her as you discover her grief and other plot elements that I'm not going to spoil. But it is truly well done, and frankly, the most unnerving feeling I've felt in a video game ever. The game is absolutely atmospheric, and that is one of the things it does extremely well, is it puts you in the shoes of a character who you genuinely believe has these symptoms of psychosis, and you share them with her. In fact, it is sort of insinuated periodically that you are one of the many things inside of her head, which is even crazier. And it's funny because we're going to roll a little bit into gameplay here. Some of the things that you have to do in the game, such as move through these different portals and things like that to change the world around you, walking back and forth on one side of this portal to try and determine what has and hasn't changed. And when you stop and think about what you're doing with the character, she's actually walking back and forth, strafing, and it looks like she's got mental problems. So not only are you feeling that way, but you're making her act that way from a gameplay perspective because you're trying to understand what the hell you're supposed to do. And from a thematic and representational perspective, that is truly unique and smartly crafted. I think that's very cool. So from a sound design and gameplay perspective, the theme and feel, you very much feel as if Senua has these mental problems and these internal strifes that you're combating, and you are part of that. This game is absolutely immersive. And that brings me to my next point. Is there such a thing as too immersive? I and my playthrough team have had big debates over this and arguments. Some people loved it, and some people absolutely hated it. So, this is going to be for you to decide, and I will keep this as factual as possible to what is in the game, because that is what we are about. The game provides you no HUD, provides you no cues on enemies, provides you no hints on what to do outside of a couple comments from the voices inside Senua's head and one of the other characters. It gives you very little guidance. It never tells you how to do combat. It never tells you how to interact with anything. It never tells you how to do key focus mechanics to solve puzzles and things like that in the game. It literally just says, here is the game, now do it. From a cinematic experience perspective, if you are playing this as an experience, that is brilliant and well crafted and smartly done, and they did a good job. If you're playing it as a video game, it's bad. It does cinematic experience things and atmospheric things extremely well, and it just simply doesn't do video game things. When you play a game, you're expected to be taught the prime core mechanics of the game. This doesn't teach you anything. The only time you see any kind of controls and gameplay information is A, if you open the menu, and B, when you effectively die your first time, which you're kind of forced into doing without spoiling anything. You're told that if you die too many times, basically your save file's deleted and you have to start the game all over. Those are the only two things that represent it being a game, and one of them is hidden in the start menu. There's no active save feature either. It's just you have to get to checkpoints and things like that. So if you're getting this game and expecting it to be a game, like I stated before, it is more like you are playing an interactive movie experience, which is cool, but not what was necessarily expected. Now, in Ninja Theory's defense, they certainly did not advertise it as a game, and they did not advertise it for its combat perspective. So, that is not a knock against Ninja Theory, but that is something that people thinking about buying the game should be aware of, and I certainly want to make that very clear. Another point of not doing gamey things well, but doing cinematic and experience things well, the combat at first felt a little choppy and almost too simplistic, because it doesn't explain to you the idea of combos and meshing moves together and things like that. But one of the things that they did to alleviate that is a lot of the commands and movements and controls in it feel kind of industry standard, if you will. So it's very easy to pick up and press the buttons and recognize what's going on and then put them together. But some of the animations felt a little bit choppy because of the way they're pieced together and how flowing combat can be for the player. But also, it adds to the realism effect in that you play all these games where you do these flips and backspins and crazy parries and things like that, and it's not realistic, and they went for a more realism in a mystical setting type thing with this game. And so I think the stiffness of the combat actually more reflects accurate sword combat from what I understand. And it's less of the animations that are stiff and more of a thematic style they went for. Another issue with the combat, however, is it is actually more intricate on the player's end of things than it lets on to be. And part of that is because it never goes over how to do combat in the game. In that you can do these dashing leaping strikes that I had no idea until about halfway through the playthrough that I could do. You could also attack immediately after dodges, which I didn't know I could do until again about halfway through. And that rolls into one of the game things that it doesn't do well, is you encounter only a few numbers of enemies outside of bosses, and they each do a couple different things, which is standard, and a reasonable number of the enemies you can cheese the hell out of. I'm not going to tell you how, I'll leave that for you to discover, but from a gameplay perspective, that's kind of a thing that's a little taboo in games as of now. It didn't used to be. That used to be like, well, if you can figure out how to do it within the system, it's okay, and you can still make that argument, but when you can just repeat the same line of commands over and over and over and over and over and succeed against the enemy, then it stops being more of a game and it starts being more of a chore when you know that that option is available to you. So I think that's another, I don't want to say failure, I think shortcoming is a better comment on that. That's another shortcoming of the combat system within Senua's Sacrifice, is you can cheese it and kind of bypass it. That being said, the enemy are afforded a few luxuries that feel unfair, so it's nice as the player to have that option. Particularly before you can do anything to them, and often as you are becoming aware of their presence, they're already mid-swing in their attack animation, and a lot of times they will get a free hit off, and that's very annoying, especially when the consequences for dying too many times is so high. There are a couple different difficulties for combat. They have easy, medium, hard, and a feature called auto, which we're not completely sure what that means. I think that just means the difficulty is adaptable based on how many deaths you've had or how well you do in combat typically. So that's a nice feature, I suppose you can say. But outside of those thoughts on combat and generally how the game is more of an interactive cinematic experience than an actual game, that's our first impressions for now. We're enjoying it, it is interesting, but it is definitely not what we expected, which was a game. It's more of a story that we're getting to play through. Which is kind of what Ninja Theory was getting at when they were building this. It's more about Senua and the world and her trials. So, overall, I think Ninja Theory most likely hit their mark with what they were doing, but as gamers, at least here at YAGR, we failed to understand that it wasn't a game so much as Hellblade, I guess is the best way to describe it. It is a unique experience crafted specifically for this game and for the people who are interested in the game. So from that degree, I think it's very cool, and right now I would say if you're interested in something like this, which is essentially a walking simulator and puzzles and a lot of interesting plot with a little bit of combat and boss fights sprinkled in, I would say, yeah, Hellblade's a good pickup based off my first impressions alone. But we still have much more of the game to get through, and in fact our deep dive and final verdict coming out later this week. So, hopefully I'll see you for those. This has been the YAGR team, and we'll see you online soon.